English 9. How are you? Hope you're doing good. Um, I thought I would go ahead and start with Romeo and Juliet the way I normally start in my classroom, and that's to give you some background on Shakespeare. So, people have this big idea that Shakespeare was this famous author and he's just so talented and all this stuff. And he is. He's amazing. But Shakespeare was first and foremost an actor and a playwright. So Shakespeare worked and was partial owner in the Globe Theater. So while I talk, I'm going to try to sketch out this really, I'm not an art teacher, but really rough sketch of what the Globe Theater was. So Shakespeare was a little bit ahead of his time in that all of the actors who worked at the Globe Theater were also partial owners in the Globe Theater. And so when the theater did well, Shakespeare did well, and he got paid, and as did the other actors. So that's what Shakespeare was trying to do. He wanted to get people to his theater to see shows and pay admission. And live theater during Shakespeare's time was what today's I would say movie theater, but even more like Netflix, people can just go on Netflix and watch whatever they want. The theater then was the same thing. It was entertainment for the masses. I'm watching my dog chase the mailman out the window. He's in the fence, but he can still get him in his mind. Sorry, got distracted. So lots of people went to the theater, and all different kinds of people went to the theater. So this is like old school, low tech lecture here. Okay, so this is my very rough sketch of what the Globe Theater would have been shaped like. This is your stage, and it's semicircular. So if the stage would have been here in the center, sorry, my directions are all backwards. If the stage would have been here in the center, that's called theater in the round. And I've personally seen some productions of theater in the round. And the idea is the audience is on all sides. But Shakespeare's Globe Theater wasn't quite theater in the round. Theater was happening on three sides of the stage. Maybe if I bring this out, it'll be easier. Okay, so Shakespeare's Globe was an open air theater, and it was partially covered. So this ring around here is like balconies, and there were 3 tiers of balconies, and they had a roof over them. So it's like 3 little stories. And then here's, of course, your stage, and it's partially covered as well. And then this area here in the center is open air. So it's just like dirt on the bottom, and it's open to the outdoors. So Shakespeare had to appeal to all different monetary income levels, and also men and women and everybody who came to his shows, because the broader his appeal, the more people would come. So the people who came in and sat in the center, where admission was very, very cheap, available to almost anybody, those were called groundlings. So the groundlings came in, they paid admission. There's no seats in here. You just stood and watched the show. You would have been actually a little bit below. I keep leaning forward and making my shoulders hurt, but you would have actually been a little bit below the level of the action because the stage was slightly raised. So you would have been looking up at the actors. And then your area around here is raised. So your first level was kind of level with the groundlings, kind of eyeball level with the stage. And then you had 2 different layers above that. Excuse me. This is just a little side note, but if things calm down soon, I have tickets to see The Shakespeare show, Much Ado About Nothing, in the reproduction of the Globe Theatre in London. I'm supposed to go in July. So fingers crossed that I'm going to get to see the reproduction Globe Theatre. The real Globe Theatre is not there and hasn't been there forever, like, centuries. Because it was just made out of wood and it burned down a couple times while they were still open, and it either burned down or fell down after that. But they have rebuilt a reproduction. Okay, so that's your idea of what the globe looked like. I'm going to put this down and I may pull it back up. Okay, so he had all these different income levels. The people who were sitting like in the balcony seats, they were paying pretty good money to see the shows. And so Shakespeare had to appeal to them as well, and their interests were different. So the groundlings, they wanted pure entertainment. And we're generalizing a little bit, but these are like working class people. Their lives were pretty rough and not really exciting or glamorous. Like, times were tough. So they wanted an escape. And the people who were sitting in those balcony seats, they could have been lower level royals, famous people, doctors, generally people with higher incomes and more education. And so they went to see Shakespeare for the Shakespearean language. Like, Shakespeare is a poet, regardless of whether you're reading his poems or not. He's a master of language. And if he weren't a master of language, we wouldn't still be reading his plays. I think I'd have to look at the dates exactly, but I think it's like 800 years later that we're reading Romeo and Juliet. But Shakespeare wrote it to be performed. And that's one thing people really struggle with is they're like, oh, I'm supposed to understand everything, and Shakespeare is such a master of language and all this stuff. Yes, he is, and yes, there's a reason we're still reading it 800 years later, but Shakespeare did not write Romeo and Juliet or any of his other plays for English students to read in a classroom 800 years later. He wrote his plays for production. And so one of the things that I always do is we watch Shakespeare in performance, because so much of what is happening in the play is not written in the play. Like most modern scripts, they've added what's called the stage direction, and my actors know, like, stage direction is what you're physically doing on the stage. And what you're physically doing on the stage is important. So it may or may not be featured in the text, but any production is going to rely on it. It's like so essential to know, well, for instance, like, they're sword fighting and so got stabbed and fell down, or Romeo's like on the balcony and he's looking down at Juliet, and Juliet's like on the ground and she's looking up at Romeo. Like, that stuff is hinted at in the text, but it may or may not be directly stated. So we are going to look at it and watch it in addition to read it, because Shakespeare wrote for production. And I talked about Shakespeare's diverse audience, and Shakespeare wrote to that diverse audience. Like, Shakespeare was a master of knowing what his audience wanted and playing upon that. So, like, everybody thinks that Shakespeare is like so highbrow and sophisticated. Like, I read Shakespeare, I'm so smart and stuff. But Shakespeare, like, knew a good poop joke. Like, Shakespeare made some pretty good poop jokes. Like, I'm not a fan of the poop joke, but, Shakespeare was pretty good at it. Shakespeare has lots of sex jokes in his writing because, like, people are interested in that. It gets your attention. So there's poop jokes, there's sex jokes, there's jokes about people being old and ugly and all kinds of stuff. So That's another thing that people don't realize about Romeo and Juliet. It is so funny if you know what's going on. It's not all serious. And the first half of the play could be a comedy. It's just like there's one turning point and then all of a sudden it's tragedy. And Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. Like, spoiler alert, it doesn't have a happy ending. That's not what you're going to see. Excuse me. But if it were all just like downer, boring, like, baha, this is so sad, like, I'm going to bawl my eyes out. Like, people wouldn't pay for that. That's not what they need. Like, Shakespeare's audience wanted an escape and they wanted to be taken to another place. And Shakespeare did that. Like, Shakespeare didn't necessarily do a lot of traveling. And most people at that time didn't. It just wasn't something you did. Like, you were born in London, which is where Shakespeare was, and you died in London. But Shakespeare sets his plays in what people of the time would have considered like exotic locales. So some of his plays take place on deserted islands and in other exotic countries. And Romeo and Juliet takes place in Italy. Ultimately, we're still in London when we're watching the play. But he talks about Verona is the setting of the play. And all of the characters speak English, but, it's very Italian and exotic and different because these people who were in England, like, probably would never go anywhere besides England. So Shakespeare wrote his plays as an escape. It's like something different and unique and exciting that you could do. I'm going to pause this for a second because my dog wants in. Hold on just a second. I'll be right back.